We're on a mission from God.
And now for something completely different.
Let's get ready to rumble! Yeah, baby, yeah!
This is Pastor Jolly John Lekumsky.
And this is Pastor Matt Youngblood Clark.
And you are listening to Wrestling with the Basics. Matt, and I know it is the Lenten season now, and usually we try to not be so humorous during the Lenten season, although I suppose people would say that's probably true of us any time of the year. We're not that
It's not
that
any
humorous.
different.
No. But I'm sorry. I do have to give a dumb joke here. And it is a pure act of nepotism. I really apologize for that. But my grandson texted me a joke, and I just have to share it with you. So are you ready?
I'm ready. How could you pass that up, John? Yeah. Good.
Well, I know. And he texted it to me. You know what I'm saying? How often does your grandson text you a joke? He says,
great.
What do you call someone who doesn't like German people?
Ooh, I haven't heard this one. I don't know. What do you call him, John?
A germaphobe. A germaphobe. And he says I came up with this one myself too.
Wow.
And why I want to. Yeah. So he made this up. And what made me feel good as a grandfather is to know that my rather astute sense, my very, very wonderful sense of humor has been passed down, not just to my son, but also to the next generation, my grandson. And it makes you proud as a grandfather to see, this very intelligent humor that I have, that's been passed on to yet another generation.
That's right. That's great.
So,
KFUO rejoices with you, John. Oh boy, more jokes are coming.
So one more story. So I'm with my granddaughter, Lauren, and she says, I'm not feeling too well. I think I'm pale. And I said, well, if you wouldn't have that bucket on your head. And I said, you get it? Bucket, pale. And she kind of grunted and grumbled. And I said, hey, this is as good as it's going to get. And her answer was, I know, Grandpa.
I know, Grandpa.
Put down by my 12-year-old granddaughter. So,
deep down inside, they love it, John. They're laughing on the inside. I just know it.
Yeah. Well, at least one of my grandchildren is going in the same steps that I've gone in, so we can rejoice in that. All right, it is the season of Lent. We do have more important things to do rather than just dumb jokes. Although we're going to actually backtrack to something that happened right before the season of Lent started, and what is it that you wanted to talk about today, Matt?
Well, I'd like to talk about the Transfiguration, because like you alluded to, John, this is sort of a big moment, a big event that happens right before we talk about Lent. And really, when you think about it, when you look at the biblical text and the gospel text, this is kind of a literally a high point, right, in Jesus' ministry. But it's as Jesus begins to then, set his face toward Jerusalem. And from here on out, then we really start to focus on Jesus going to Jerusalem, preparing for those events of Holy Week, Palm Sunday, Good Friday, and of course Easter as well. So it does make sense that we take some time to take a look at this as we begin that journey in the season of Lent this year as well. So that's what we'd like to take a look at today.
There's several versions of the Transfiguration. Which of the accounts are we going to work with, Matt?
So let's look at Matthew. Let's look at Matthew chapter 17, beginning with verse 1. Yeah, I think let's zero in on that. And before we get into that, John, just a little quiz for you and for our listeners.
Oh, no.
It's It's name that disciple. All right. So you ready?
Name
I'm going to
that disciple. Okay, all right,
give you some
cool.
clues and see if you can name that disciple. Okay.
All right. Do I need,
Anyway, here we
to
go.
press a buzzer or anything?
So
Do I
it's
need to press it?
yeah. That's right. You can buzz in
Okay.
whenever you want.
Do I need to buzz in? Okay, all
So
right.
it's a disciple of Jesus. So you got a 1 in 12 shot already, John. So how hard can it
Okay.
be, right?
All right.
This disciple was called by Jesus while he was fishing in the Sea of Galilee. All right.
All right. Well, now we've brought it down to 4.
That
Okay,
narrows
we
it
got
down a
4
little
of them.
bit, right?
Yep. Yeah.
This disciple has a brother named Andrew.
Beep.
Okay. All right,
Is there
John.
more?
Name that disciple.
Did I interrupt you too soon?
No,
But
that's all
it's
right.
Peter.
Go ahead. It's Peter. It's Peter. I knew
Peter.
you'd get it.
Yeah,
You're a
okay.
pastor after all, right? You got it. But it's Peter, and to just highlight a few other Peter characteristics. If I would have kept giving clues, they would have included that he is one of those 3 that follows Jesus during those special times in his ministry, right? Along with James and John. Peter, impulsive. It seems like he'll act and speak sometimes before he actually thinks things through. And Peter, too, I think we see again and again, has kind of a tough time listening to Jesus. And I think that's going to become important today. And when we think about Peter and those characteristics, a follower of Jesus and, maybe a little impulsive, maybe has a tough time listening. I think maybe we can identify a little with Peter, right? A faithful disciple, follower of Jesus, but yet far from perfect, and sometimes has a tough time listening specifically even to Jesus. And maybe we can identify with Peter. So as we look at the Transfiguration text, I want us to focus in on Peter especially today, and look at him and what he does, what he says, what he doesn't do or doesn't say here at the Transfiguration. All right. So
Before we do that, though, I'd just like to share a comment, a thought that I had, because it is interesting, like you said, that these guys get singled out, Peter, James, and John. And I think we speculate, well, why? Why does he single them out? And you're going to certainly focus on why he singles out Peter. But I always thought, the thing with James is he's going to be the first one to be martyred. And so you're thinking, well, you're almost wasting this. Why are you showing James all this stuff? He's not even going to be around to tell anybody. And yet I think that's precisely why James gets to see all of these things. Because, if you're the first guy martyred, that's really rough.
Yeah.
After a few people have been martyred, then it's like, okay, I guess this is what we should expect. In fact, Jesus kind of warned us that this is the way the life of a disciple would be, that we'd follow in his footsteps, take up his cross. But I think he gave those extra signs to James because he knew James would need those for his faith. And then, of course, the same thing with John. John's just the opposite. He's going to be the last man standing. And so all the more reason that he needs to have seen all these things, because he's going to be witnessing until the end of all apostles about what's going on. And so now it'll be interesting to say, well, why maybe was Peter singled out to get to see these special signs? So I'm excited, Matt. Where do we need to go here?
Good. Okay, well, let's jump into the text. If you could read, again, Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. Let's go ahead and read the whole thing.
And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son, whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only.
Yeah, thanks, John. So just to walk through this a little bit, they're up on this mountain. Jesus picks Peter, James, and John, and then Jesus is transfigured. Well, what in the world does that even mean? He's transfigured. So the Greek word used there is the metamorphete. So that's where we get the English word metamorphosis, right? So
Yes.
he is his, yeah. So that's kind of a cool connection. So this metamorphosis, this change, this transfiguration, especially in Jesus' appearance, his face shining, his clothing bright, and a small glimpse of Jesus' glory as who he is as the Son of God. And then, to add to the glory here, to add to the remarkable nature of this Mount of Transfiguration, we have two guys, Moses and Elijah, appear there, right? Which is incredible. These Old Testament figures, and the law, the prophets. Moses, we think of the law, and then Elijah, the prophets, and the whole Testament scriptures. All the Hebrew scriptures pointing ahead to this Messiah, this promised one. Here he is. It's Jesus Christ. If there was any doubt about it, here it is. He's the one. What I think is interesting, though, is we have this detail where Moses and Elijah appear, and Jesus is speaking with them. And I always wonder, what were they talking about, right? Moses and Elijah and Jesus just kind of chatting. They're talking, and maybe they're encouraging Jesus as he, really starts to head to Jerusalem now. And, but you wonder what they were talking about. And we just don't have that detail. But getting back to Peter, it seems as though Peter interrupts their conversation. Kind of butts in,
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. So here's Moses, Elijah, and Jesus Christ talking, and he interrupts. So you think, well, if you're going to interrupt those three, you have something pretty important to say, right? Well, here's what Peter says. Well, it's good that we're here. If you want me to, I can build 3 tents: one for you, Jesus; one for Moses; one for Elijah. It's like, what, Peter? Was that really worth interrupting? And I think one of the other Gospels, John, if I remember right, it doesn't even say, Peter didn't even know what he was saying, right? He's just kind of looking for something to say. And so he interrupts. Come on, Peter. And you think about, well, why? Why is he building these tents? And I think part of it is well, Peter likes the glory. He likes what he sees here. He wants to prolong this mountaintop experience as long as he can. He knows what's at the bottom of the mountain. He knows how they've been, their message has been rejected as they've traveled. And, it's not easy being a follower of Jesus. And he wants to prolong this glory, perhaps just as long as he can. So
Jesus has told him. He's told him, is it 1 or 2 times by now that what's going to happen is he's going to go to Jerusalem, and he's going to and Peter has already rejected that. We've already had that story. Oh, that won't happen to you, Lord.
Yeah.
So you're right. Yeah, Peter is all. Two quick things. Yeah. Actually, what is it? Luke or is it Mark that tells that they were talking about his Exodus? I remember that. I don't remember the gospel.
Yes.
And they're talking about his Exodus. And it is interesting that you talked about that being an encouragement to Jesus, because Max Lucado has a really beautiful sermon on this text. And he points out that, this is probably as much for Jesus as it was for the disciples, because he's going to, it's one thing to talk about being human. It's another thing when you face your death as a human, and that's going to be an incredibly. If it's hard for Peter to accept that, imagine what it is for Jesus to be in that garden and realize, oh, this is it. Now everything that I've come for, I'm going to have to do it. It won't be easy. But anyway, it is interesting that Peter just stops the whole flow of the conversation. Well, he's probably. Don't you think Maddie's afraid? Oh, they're going to say goodbye and leave. No, we want to keep this. Yeah.
Yep.
Keep it going.
Yep, exactly. And I like how you brought up, Peter already had talked about, oh boy, I don't know about this death stuff. We'll come back to that in just a second. But that's a great point.
Yeah.
So Peter, sort of interrupts her conversation. And then what I love even more is God interrupts Peter. The Father does. Verse 5. While he was still, Peter was still speaking when a voice from the cloud said, so Peter's mid-sentence. He's still speaking. And God the Father speaks from this cloud that had overshadowed them. And the Father interrupts Peter now and says, this is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased, right? And those words are familiar, right? When else were those words spoken, John?
The baptism, which we
So
just had a few weeks ago too. Yeah.
exactly. So in the other Gospels, we read about Jesus' baptism, and the Father says the exact same thing, right? This is my Son with whom I'm well pleased. But then the Father adds 3 words here at the Transfiguration. He adds to that,
Ah,
listen to him. Listen to him.
yep. Yep.
And I think that's, isn't that interesting that after Peter interrupts, the Father reminds Peter and us too, right? Listen to him, Peter, right? Stop, stop blabbing, open your ears and listen to him. And I
Matt,
wonder, yeah, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, I just love this. I just love this because I'd never thought of it that way. Because actually, wouldn't you want to kind of hear what Moses and Elijah and Jesus are talking about?
You would think
To
so.
the opportunity? Yeah. But
You
he's
would
all
think
focused on himself, isn't he? He's just focused on
Yes, he
himself.
is. Yes, he
And
is.
it's a shame because now apparently none of them were really listening because other than the fact they spoke about their exodus, man, it would be nice to know what that conversation was. So.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we know. Yeah, exactly. We're talking about the Exodus, Jesus' exit, and everything that's going to happen in his passion. But yeah, all the specifics of the conversation. Yeah, it would be great to know. But
And it's
listen to
because
him.
of stupid Peter interrupting the whole
I
conversation.
know we could have had more
Yeah.
recorded here in the Gospels, Peter. Why did you do that? But I do wonder if those words even kind of cut Peter to the heart, right? Listen to him, because I wonder if he thinks back to those times when he hadn't, even earlier. And you kind of alluded to that already, John. So we have in chapter 16 of Matthew, just a few verses before the Transfiguration, it seems to be 6 days earlier, not that long ago. Remember,
Yeah.
Jesus is really specific about what's going to take place, right? So if you don't mind, John, chapter 16, beginning with verse 21, here's where Peter fails to listen yet again, if you could read that.
From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.
Yeah. So here it was, just days earlier, it seems, that Jesus gets specific, real specific about what's going to take place. Going to Jerusalem, suffering, right? Rejection, killed, raised on the third day. And what does Peter say? Well, this will never happen to you. So a failure to listen. Come on, Peter. He's preoccupied with his own plans for Jesus, his own agenda, and he doesn't listen. He doesn't want to hear about suffering. He doesn't want to hear about being killed, for sure. But that
Man, I'm sorry, because it just occurred to me, maybe that's why he interrupted, because they were talking about the death,
the
and the
Exodus,
suffering.
exactly. Yeah.
And I never thought, and that's why. Oh no, we don't want to talk about that. Oh man, Matt, that's a really nice thought.
Yeah.
that you've got going there.
Yeah,
That's
I like
why we
that.
want to build the. Yeah, because no, we don't want to do that. Oh, okay, wow. All right, keep going.
Yeah, because we talk about sometimes the theology of the cross and the theology of glory, right? And so it
Yeah.
seems like they're on the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus, Moses, and Elijah perhaps are talking about more of a theology of the cross, right? The suffering that's going to take place, the
Yeah.
exodus that Jesus is going to undergo. And yet, Peter, in this case, boy, he's after a theology of glory. He wants to ignore that. No, don't talk about that, guys. Let's talk about building some tents and just staying up here in the glory for a while on this mountaintop. Exactly. But Jesus knows better, right? He knows that's not how salvation works. This is why he came to this earth, was to suffer and to die. There's no resurrection without death first. There is no glory without the cross. There's no mountaintop experiences if there's not valleys too. That's the way it works for Jesus, and that's the way it's going to work for Jesus' followers. And Peter, eventually is going to find that out, right? So again, listen to him. And I think, for us, what an important message too. Because I think we're like Peter. We're slow to listen sometimes. We've got our own plans. We've got our own agendas. We know, what's best for us in our lives, and we might even think we know better than Jesus and His Word sometimes. But that same admonition for us: listen to Him, because in our Christian walk, if we're not listening to Jesus, who are we listening to? Because boy, there's a lot of people there are a lot of voices out there that want us to listen to them, and we think of just things like social media and Facebook and Twitter and politicians and news networks and commercials and ads, and the list goes on and on and on. People that want us to listen to them, and yet that one voice breaks through everything, the voice of the Father. And He says, "This is my Son. Listen to Him. Listen to Jesus." Those words are just as true for us as they were for Peter there on that Mount of Transfiguration. Yeah. Any other comments, John?
Well, it's interesting that the word there in the Greek is in the present. It's a present imperative, which means it's an ongoing thing. It has to be done all the time. It's not like you do it once and then you're finished. It just has to be something that goes on day to day. And are you going to comment on the fact what a difference it would have made if Peter had listened to Jesus in the future? When Jesus comes and says, you're going to deny me 3 times. If he'd listened to that, then things might have gone differently, because he would have said, "Oh, Lord, please help me, deliver me from that." But of course, he didn't listen there either, did he, Matt?
Exactly. Oh, hard-headed Peter. Right? Come on, Peter. What does it take for you to listen? What does it take for you to learn your lesson? And then we examine ourselves and we think, well, boy, I'm just as terrible at listening to Jesus as Peter is. And he's so many promises in God's Word, and his presence and His love and His forgiveness, and yet, so often we doubt those promises, and we doubt God's Word, and we don't listen, and whether it's that word of gospel or that word of law, Jesus knows what He's talking about. He knows what's best for us in our lives, and yet, we refuse to listen. And so I think, as we come to this season of Lent, I think this is a good lesson for us too, because, now is time to listen. Now is time to come in repentance, to pray for that change of heart and mind, to turn to Christ, and to listen anew, right? To listen anew to His Word, His words of law, His words of gospel, especially during this season of Lent. I think too, that one phrase, listen to your heart. Sometimes we're encouraged to do that. And to recognize too during Lent the reality that no, our heart is full of evil, as imperfect people. Psalm 51, that I think that's one place to look. David prays for a clean heart, right? So often what comes out of our heart, what our heart tells us, is rarely good. I mentioned that in my sermon on Transfiguration Sunday. One of our worshipers came out of worship and said, I'm gonna have to rethink that, because sometimes I say that, listen to your heart, and even that, no. Instead of listening to our own hearts, let's listen to the words of Christ. Let's listen to Jesus. What does He say? This is the Father's Son. Listen to Him, and just encourage our listeners to do that anew during this time of Lent.
And I think, Matt, it's interesting because, like you say, Jesus says out of the heart, and then He lists all the kind of evil things, adultery, stealing, whatever. So you probably don't want to listen to your heart.
Yep.
But if you listen to Jesus, sure, some of His words are really hard about our sinfulness, about the suffering and the death that will come from that. But when you listen, you also have these beautiful words that Jesus would speak to Peter later, that even though He denied Him 3 times, He said, "Guess what, Peter? You're still going to feed my sheep, tend my sheep, tend my lambs," because that's the chief word you're going to hear from Jesus, is about how we are forgiven and we are restored in Him.
Amen. And I was thinking too of, ahead to Good Friday, when Jesus speaks those words from the cross now to the Father Himself. The Father just spoke from the cloud at Transfiguration. And what does He say from the cross? Father, forgive them. These words of forgiveness that Jesus speaks from the cross. So I encourage our listeners to listen to that word too of Jesus, because that word is spoken not only for those at the cross that day, but for us who in faith come to the cross as well, as Jesus speaks back to the Father. Father, forgive them. So listen to Him. Listen to those words of Jesus. All right. Well, thanks, John, for that recap of the Transfiguration. And again, thank you to our listeners. This has been Wrestling with the Basics.